You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is Freedom Side Live. I'm Eugene Perrier, one of your hosts, here as always, alongside one of my only intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, good to be back with you.
It's great to be back with you. Are there other hosts that are
Yeah, we've been thinking about replacing you. So earlier, just before we started, we were trying out other hosts, so I just got confused when you popped on the screen.
You heard it here, guys. If you disagree with Eugene's decision to replace me.
If you disagree with my decision to replace Rania, you should go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and become a recurring patron to show your monetary support for Rania Khalek.
Oh, dear Lord. Speaking of patreon.com/breakthrough news, we are running a campaign. We just need to get a few more patrons to meet our goal of 50 new patrons in the month of February in order to get Eugene to join Instagram. So if you haven't become a patron yet, what are you waiting for? Don't you want to see Eugene on Instagram? I do.
No one does.
Become a patron. Enough people have become patrons that demonstrate that they want to see you on Instagram. Why are you denying the people what they want, Eugene?
Shout out to everyone who's become a patron. We've gotten actually a lot of people who have become patrons. We're over halfway there to the goal. So a lot of very generous people out there. That's all I'm going to say. But remember that, patreon.com/breakthrough news. Of course, for those of you watching on YouTube, the only way to watch, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit the bell so you get the alerts about all of the fantastic things here on Breakthrough News, including dispatches with Rania Khalek. But we want to just jump right into it, Rania, because we got a lot of today. We got a packed show today. Obviously, one of the biggest issues here in the United States is the train derailment and chemical spill in East Palestine, Ohio. The Breakthrough News Disruptors program has sent a team there to East Palestine. They were there last night at a town hall where allegedly Norfolk Southern Railways was going to come and answer the questions of the people. They did not, in fact, show up. So the town hall itself, was not able to answer a lot of these people's questions. Nonetheless, our Breakthrough News Disruptors team was able to talk to some of the residents there in East Palestine about the current situation after this chemical spill for them.
We've had burning of the throat, the nose, the mouth, the tongue. My lips are tingly. My youngest daughter is having problems with breathing and having to hit her inhaler more. And we're not getting answers we need. Norfolk is brushing this under the rug. I mean, I'm watching equipment go up and down my street, tankers. What are they putting in those tankers and hauling out? I got a stream that runs not even half a block from my house. What's in that stream? They're telling us, oh, well, drinking water's safe, but then they're saying, no, don't. Pregnant women don't drink the water. Well, if it's not okay for a pregnant woman, how's it okay for us? I mean, I'm afraid to bathe in my own water because you don't know what's in it.
Do you think people are going to want to buy these people's crops around here? Their businesses are ruined. I'm not eating any corn from any of these farms around here, are you? That woman that's got 3 kids and hasn't worked for 2 weeks and had to pay for a hotel, don't make her decide if she needs to wash her kids in that poisoned water or not. And that's what's happening. Those are the decisions that are being made. Well, the stock price is being protected instead, not them. Cowards. The politicians and the CEOs of this company, cowards. So long as corporations are allowed to buy the politicians, this isn't going to end. Most important thing's profit. It's not these people. And it's just bullshit. It takes people out of the equation. And it's a perfect example right here. A bomb was dropped.
Once again, those are voices from East Palestine, Ohio, last night from residents affected by the chemical spill. And again, that's our Breakthrough Disruptors team. And definitely go to breakthroughnews.org, breakthroughnews.org. You can learn more about Disruptors and become one yourself. It's a volunteer network of people's journalists around the country and around the world. So we will continue to be bringing you more from East Palestine. So definitely follow us, certainly here on YouTube, and also, of course, at BT Newsroom across all your social media platforms. But unfortunately, that this spill did happen, but it has refocused the country's attention, you could say, I guess, on these issue of train derailments, the issues of the railroads, many of the things that the railroad workers were trying to point us to during their contract struggle at the end of 2022. And we are very happy to be joined as we continue the conversation by Matt Weaver, who's the BMWED IBT Ohio Legislative Director and the Rail Workers United ISC member, or a Rail Workers United ISC member. Matt, thanks so much for being with us.
Hello, everyone. How are you guys? I really appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us, and we're doing well. And of course, now in Van Buren Township outside of Detroit, there's been another derailment of a train that was carrying chemicals. It looks, thankfully, that there may not be a spill yet. But I guess my first question for you, Matt, is, I mean, should we have seen these things coming? Because I think a lot of times these are presented as just freak accidents.
I believe that many of the rail labor groups have announced concerns like this on deferred maintenance, on lack of manpower, on poor resting times for our train crews, things like that. Railroad Workers United, railroadworkersunited.org, has been talking about this for months. It's a shame to watch, kind of like Band-Aid on a broken leg maintenance. And in this specific one in Ohio, you can't speculate on the exact cause till the NTSB report comes out. But our car inspectors, the machinists and BRC, Brotherhood of Railway Carmen, have been mandated to reduce inspection times. Used to be 2 guys working 4 or 5 minutes to inspect each car. Those numbers are down to 90 seconds, sometimes less than a minute, that they're mandating that we are the rail workers are inspecting cars that much quicker, and it gives a lot of opportunity to miss things such as a hot journal, a worn bearing, air hoses, brake hoses, that kind of stuff.
Mm.
And so when we talk about what's happened now, I mean, it obviously residents are being told everything's fine. Is everything fine?
I would prefer that they do some independent testing instead of something coming from the carrier. You can often pay for the results you want. You know how that game is played. I would think they should err on the side of safety. I know that, even the administration in DC offered help, and Governor DeWine declined that. He said he didn't call back for that. I don't understand that, because I see people all the time saying, well, what's Biden doing about it? Well, he offered, and he was declined by the governor.
Mm. And, I guess one of the things that is just so notable to me is it's not only that, and I'm glad you gave the context of the cutbacks, but I mean, it really seems that it's not because somehow these companies are strapped for cash. I mean, it feels that these railroad companies are some of the biggest, most profitable companies out there. Is that right?
Record profits. There is no other industry that has profit margins that are, creeping up. They're shooting for operating ratios of 55. Fast food has operating ratios of 85, 90. So the shareholders are getting, that much more money. It's a very wealthy industry. And as you can see in the video you're showing right now, trains don't run through wealthy people's backyards. That's working class families and neighborhoods that are suffering through this.
I want to ask about accountability, because in the aftermath of this, I saw that there was a meeting where the rail firm actually pulled out of. It was a meeting with residents. So is there any accountability here at all? Like, are there officials at least advocating, local officials? Are there any local officials advocating for the community that's been affected by this? Let alone for the workers who've probably are who have been work on the trains and deal with this on a regular basis?
I've seen some comments from local officials who are trying to get answers and help their constituents. I've been a bit disappointed with the Department of Transportation. Pete Buttigieg has seemed to be slow off the starting blocks on this, and I really had my hopes up when he was appointed. I think we need our regulators to regulate. We need our public servants to serve the public, and let's make society better for the working class in America, because times are tough for the workers.
And I wonder if, and I know this conversation has also been certainly something Rail Workers United has really, I think, put in front of the country quite well, since the contract fight. I mean, the very issue of the ownership of the railroads. I mean, I think that the United States is actually now leading, I don't know, someone told me they're leading the world. There's a large number of train derailments, it seems, on a regular basis. And I mean, is this sort of private ownership model itself part of the problem?
That is an interesting aspect, and there are very good arguments about nationalizing the railroads. I would prefer to see good regulation first, but if how can you trust a private industry that is touting record profits and dividends? How can you trust them to self-regulate? That's not possible. Those ideas of self-regulation of a for-profit industry is pie in the sky thoughts. It's not realistic.
So, okay, that's one thing, nationalizing the rails, but like, what could have prevented this specific incident? What kind of safety protocols that aren't in place could have prevented this?
I I would venture to say that a more thorough inspection of the car may have helped. Hot box detectors more often on the tracks as the trains go by. They can discover if there's been a hot journal. This train, from what I hear, has gone over 20 miles with flames or with sparks coming out of the journal or the bearing before it derailed. So that's a lot of time where you have the opportunity to stop the train. And like you guys had said before, there was better regulation that kind of got gutted during the Obama administration, but then it was completely eliminated during the Trump administration. So they're making plenty of money. Let's do better.
Mm. Well, and I wonder from the perspective, just of the rights of workers. I mean, I've been thinking about the Railway Labor Act. And of course, as I mentioned before, and as you mentioned, I mean, rail workers were really ringing the alarm bell on this, saying we have big issues with staffing and safety. And it just makes me wonder if, another problem here is the fact that we've by basically making it very, very difficult for workers to strike, it's almost like we've made it more difficult to address the issues because workers aren't able to use their own labor power to say, well, hold on, we got to put a stop to this thing until we get this fixed.
Especially in this round of bargaining, that's exactly what happened. During the STB hearings, the shippers were kind of on our side saying, hey, hire more people, get the trains to us, haul our goods away, that kind of stuff. And then towards the end of bargaining, the shippers turned on us and asked Congress to impose the contract. That's not the voice of the people. I mean, we need to have public servants serving the constituents. We need to have regulation that serves society. The idea that the railroad spends so much money lobbying politicians. They have, I testified for the Ohio House Transportation Committee about crossing safety and two-man crew bills, and there were lobbyists in the back room just listening into what I had to say. There's a lot of power in the railroad. I mean, in 1900, there were 132 Class 1 railroads. Now there's 7, perhaps a merger to make it 6. We're looking at the monopoly board. There were 4 railroads on the monopoly board, and they have a lot of power. I asked you guys not to use my employer's name just because of fear of retaliation.
I wanted to ask you something about, Pete Buttigieg, who's obviously transportation secretary, he gave this interview where he tried to kind of shift some of the blame onto Donald Trump. I think he actually even tweeted about it. Basically, there's some ruling that was overturned by the Trump administration back in 2018 or withdrawn by the Trump administration back in 2018, requiring trains carrying certain dangerous chemicals to use these electronically controlled brakes. And he was saying that this was partly the result of that. I'm just curious, is there any truth to that? And 2, is there a difference in the way these two parties deal with these issues, or is it kind of a bipartisan situation where both parties seem to be captured by these very powerful companies?
From what I read, it is true that they did studies and there was an agenda or pressure to show that the cost effectiveness of this braking system, it wasn't worth the return on investment. They're looking for ROI, and it wasn't. It's there's still debate on if the electronic brakes would have hampered or slowed the train quicker or better or more evenly. But let's study that. Let's investigate that stuff. And I do see a difference in the parties, but I am a little frustrated with having to vote for what seems to be the lesser of two evils every 2 or 4 years.
Understandable. And then I wanted to also ask you, the photos of this are horrifying. The images of this are horrifying. The aftermath is horrifying. But this isn't the only derailment. Eugene mentioned before we started this interview that there was another derailment that happened in just the last few hours, I believe, in Michigan, just outside of Detroit. And I saw that there's been over like 1,000 derailments. I think that was the number over a certain time period. That's kind of a shocking number. Obviously, not every derailment is this catastrophic. But all that being said, is this unique what happened, or is this something we should see as like a warning of what could also continue to happen? Like, how concerned should we be about the potential for more derailments like this?
Derailments in yards are a bit more common in the yard, in the switching yards, on the switching leads, that kind of thing. This one has really grabbed the media's attention. Like I said, I appreciate your guys' attention. But don't get me wrong, we don't want these chemicals on the highways. That would be much worse. Accidents on the highways are far more often. Rail is definitely the safest way to move these chemicals across the country. I've had friends who say, "Oh, it should be a pipeline." Well, you can't have a different pipeline for every single chemical across the world. You can't have a grid of pipelines for vinyl chloride. You can't have a grid of pipelines for petroleum. That's just not realistic. Pipelines are not the answer in the circumstance. Safer transportation is.
Well, let me also just ask you this, because I think that's a very good point. Where can people find out more about what you all are doing at Rail Workers United or anywhere else that seems relevant? Because I think a lot of folks, of course, were, very positively inclined towards what was happening during the contract period, and seeing this now are thinking we have to do more to get behind rail workers.
There was an additional press release from railroadworkersunited.org today. It had 4 or 5 articles. I even got some time on the Jon Stewart show yesterday.
Nice.
And they've done well. We have a media committee of 16 or 18 people and of various crafts. So somebody talks about a machinist or a carman or an engineer conductor. Somebody can go there, send any of us an email, go on Facebook and find it, and we will get the right person to get the right. Just like you said earlier, it's not good business to speculate on these things. So the finger pointing will always begin, but let's leave it in the hands of the NTSB for now. And let's ask Norfolk Southern to step up and do right by the citizens of this town who are dealing with this.
Mm-hmm. No, 100%. Matt Weaver, BMW ED IBT Ohio Legislative Director and a member of the ISC at Railroad Workers United. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks, you guys. I really appreciate you guys. Have a great day.
No, you too. It's our pleasure.
Oof.
No, well, really terrible situation. And, thank God for the organized workers on the railways to be able to, ring the alarm about this, help us explain it, and, offer a real pushback. Because, I think, I don't even know what the number is. Actually over 1,000, I think, every year. I believe I read, maybe it was in Newsweek, that from 1990 to 2021, there's like 54,000 derailments or something of that nature. So it's way more common than I thought. I remember once when I was in D.C., there was a situation like this. I think it was chlorine that was leaking, but they had to evacuate a bunch of places over by Rhode Island Avenue and 4th Street Northeast. I don't know if you know D.C., because it was like, there's a slight derailment and these chemicals were everywhere and potentially they could explode. It was pretty scary because a family member of mine lived right 3 blocks away from there at the time.
That's really frightening. I think oftentimes we're used to only really hearing about derailments when there's like trains of people traveling on like the Amtrak or something, and like people are hurt or something or injured, which we don't think about all of the other things that are transported across the railways in the US, including chemicals that you need to get to various places for many reasons that are beside the point right now, but it is frightening to think. I do want to say, I know we're about to go to another interview shortly.
Sure.
I'm a bit rattled though. There was another earthquake, which was felt
Just
in
now?
Beirut. No, which was before we started the show. And I just keep getting messages from friends. There was another earthquake. It originated in central Turkey that was like a 5.2 magnitude. So
Wow.
I wonder how that was felt closer to the areas that were impacted last week.
Well, a little bit later in the show, we're actually going to be talking to someone from Turkey specifically about the issue of the relief efforts there. And so if something happened there, we'll certainly hear about it for sure. And of course, we're nearing 42,000. Earlier today, we were nearing 42,000 deaths. We might be actually over that toll now. I haven't checked in a couple hours, but it's hard to see the tolls keep climbing. But of course, Turkey and Syria deeply, deeply affected by this. In similar situations, but in very different situations because of the sanctions that have been placed on Syria. And we're very honored as we continue the show to be joined by Professor Elena Douan, who is a UN Special Rapporteur and a professor of international law. Professor, thank you so much for joining us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting.
No, very, very happy to have you. And I guess that's my first question is, how are sanctions impacting relief efforts in Syria? The U.S. government, of course, is telling people in the media here that they aren't impacting them at all. They have no impact on humanitarian relief. So I wonder from your perspective what the real story is.
Well, I need to say that I know the situation in Syria pretty well, take into account that I did my country visit just 3 months ago. That's why I had the possibility to talk to many humanitarian actors on the ground and see the challenges they face in their humanitarian work, even before the earthquake happened. And even before the earthquake, they were referring to the very serious problems in delivery of humanitarian aid, even the types of humanitarian aids which were exactly fitting the formally existing humanitarian exceptions like food and medical equipment. Even for the majority of these deliveries, they were supposed to get a number of licenses, even, for example, a license to fuel the car inside of the Syria to deliver humanitarian aid from the border to the place of destination. Getting humanitarian licenses took a long time for them, and sometimes it lasted for several months, if not years, to get the license and deliver humanitarian aid. They were referring to the problems to get donations and to do fundraising because any IP addresses or Syrian IP addresses and phone numbers were blocked. So donors couldn't provide humanitarian assistance. And anything which went beyond medicine and food was absolutely prohibited to be delivered to the country in order not to be interpreted as helping reconstruction or rebuilding of the country and therefore claiming to support the government of Syria. And unfortunately, in this situation, when Syria faced extremely serious problems with access to water, to electricity, majority of cities had electricity only 1 or 2 hours per day. Access to clean water was extremely limited. That's why there were cholera outbreaks. There was an enormous shortage of fuel in the country, so people couldn't afford that. And there was a very serious shortage of the equipment because it couldn't be delivered due to sanctions regimes. And therefore, in the aftermath of the break, there was a problem to get to the problems, to the places affected by the earthquake, to help people to get out from under the stones and to deliver these people to the hospitals. Hospitals were facing very serious shortage of the medicine and medical equipment, so even, for example, catheters to use for blood transfusions, as well as serious equipment like X-rays or CT scanners for people injured or wounded by the earthquake. And besides the public banks and 2 private banks in Syria, which used to deal with international transaction, were designated in the sanctions list, were cut off SWIFT. Therefore, people, as well as the humanitarian organization, the country couldn't get donations from outside, even from their relatives and friends. And naturally, all this undermined the preparedness of Syria to deal with the consequences of the earthquake, and plus it prevented the activity of humanitarian organizations in this sphere. I naturally am aware of the General License of the United States 23, which was issued on February 8, and I welcome this license a lot because it already opens some ways for delivery of humanitarian aid and financial transactions, although I believe that it's not enough, taking into account that For example, for the third actors like banks, it's very complicated to differentiate what is the relief operations entitled by the license and, for example, reconstruction and rebuilding transactions which are prohibited by other sanctions regimes. So I'm absolutely sure that many banks and many actors will decide to overcomply and not to risk. Moreover, the license doesn't contain a guarantee for humanitarian actors that they won't be punished for their humanitarian work. And moreover, the last point, other countries which impose sanctions on Syria didn't issue any humanitarian derogation, general humanitarian license to enable the free flow of humanitarian assistance to Syria.
You know, I'm curious what needs to happen. Like, I mean, if the US is going to issue a general license for what, like 180 days, in a way, it's demonstrating that they are aware that their sanctions are, in fact, obstructing humanitarian aid. So, given that this earthquake has highlighted just how horrible the sanctions are, what needs to happen in the aftermath of this? If you were in charge, like, what would you do?
First of all, if I would be in charge, I would request everyone to observe standards of international law, because the majority of unilateral sanctions imposed today do not correspond to the standards of international law. And therefore, the effect on human rights is just the consequence of the illegal behavior. Well, as a first step, in the press release, which has recently been issued by 10 special rapporteurs, we are lift sanctions which prevent reconstruction and rebuilding of Syria. Plus, we request to make sure that the delivery of humanitarian aid is not impeded. Humanitarian organizations, which are already doing an enormously complicated and dangerous job on the ground, they shouldn't face the risk to be designated for violation of sanctions regimes and to be prevented of doing this work. And naturally, all these complicated legal terminology in the exemptions, exceptions, and derogations prevent many humanitarian steps to be taken. They prevent country for reconstruction. They prevent country from development. People can't live with water, without food, without money, without electricity. They need to be able to build up their lives and to live the decent life.
You know, one of the things that you mentioned that I think is really important when we talk about sanctions is this issue of overcompliance. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that, because I think a lot of people feel, well, if it's like quote unquote technically legal, that, you know, anyone would be willing to then go ahead and do some business transaction. But overcompliance is a huge issue in Syria and other nations that I know are hit with sanctions.
Indeed, today overcompliance turned to be a really huge issue, and it exacerbates the impact of the direct unilateral sanctions enormously. One of the problems is that the legal regulations imposing unilateral sanctions, because of the fact of their dual legality from the point of international law, they are very confusing and they are very complicated. The majority of terms are unexplained there, and therefore no one knows what exactly is prohibited. Point number two, there are usually a number of countries, not a single one, which imposes unilateral sanctions. And as a result, these sanctions are overlapped, but they are not equal. So basically, in order to be precise about what exactly is allowed and what exactly is prohibited, you need to get exactly about a single country against a specific sphere to be able to verify this element. At the very end, when it comes to the check-in, no private bank or no private individual is able to do all the verification. Moreover, many sanctioning regulations provide for the possibility to impose sanctions or to start criminal or civil case for circumvention of sanctions regime. And as far as no one is absolutely sure what exactly is prohibited by sanctions, many businesses and banks prefer to use so-called zero-risk policy. So they are not sure that something is prohibited, but they prefer not to risk. And at the very end, it ends up in situation when, for example, no one checks what exactly is prohibited as concerns Syria. they decide not to act as soon as they hear the word Syria. So the private businesses and banks and even individuals and universities decide not to have anything to do if it involves Syrian nationals, Syrian companies, or the country of destination is Syria. That's why, for example, I have referred to the problems to do fundraising for humanitarian organizations. If they have Syrian phone number or Syrian IP address, they are immediately blocked. Many humanitarian organizations registered in Europe have complained that their fundraising programs have been blocked by fundraising platforms as soon as identified that humanitarian assistance will be directed to Syria or will be delivered to Syria. That's overcompliance.
I also want to ask about the issue of other countries, because something that's unique about the sanctions on Syria is that there's these secondary sanctions that the US has deemed it can apply to other countries who engage in economic activity with Syria. So it's this issue of like extraterritoriality. Can you address that issue and then how it has potentially impeded efforts for other countries to help Syria in the aftermath of this earthquake?
Indeed, the issue of secondary sanctions is one of the very important reasons why many countries, many businesses, and many banks end up in overcompliance. So, from the other side, their risks are not grounded because in reality, the Caesar Act implemented by the United States in 2019 expressly provides for the possibility to designate third country nationals and companies if they are engaged in reconstruction or rebuilding of Syria. To be able to understand what reconstruction and rebuilding is, means that even if one tries to deliver spare parts to maintain water pump or to maintain electricity station, it's already reconstruction or rebuilding. If one tries to get training for school teachers how to teach math to the first grade at school, if we speak about the public schools, it's construction building. So the understanding of the public sector or understanding of support of the government is enormously broad. Even if someone wants to do, I would say, a lesson for street children in the building, public building provided by the government, they need extra license to do it. And sometimes they can't get this license because the building is public, and that means that they enable the capacity of the government to take care of anything what's happening on the territory. Therefore, I would refer to the of extraterritoriality. From the point of international law, extraterritoriality is absolutely illegal, and it's confirmed even by several countries which impose sanctions on its own. For example, the European Union, sanctions of which are also dubious from the point of international law, and I would say in the majority of cases they're illegal. The European Union explicitly said that extraterritoriality is against international law. And many humanitarian exceptions provided by the European Union directly refer to the fact that the businesses of the European Union are not supposed to implement and comply with sanctions of the United States. At the same time, businesses are not prohibited, are not protected against possible punishment. That's why they comply anyway.
Wow.
Yeah, wow, that's just amazing on so many different levels, and you know, I mean, I think it's notable here that we have seen. I think the point you made at the beginning that even prior to the earthquake, there were so many different challenges to the humanitarian situation, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that because, of course, the two things are related. I mean, if there are so many difficulties in rebuilding from a war, if you then have an earthquake, you know, it's compounding crises. So it's not just one crisis than another, but they sort of are building on one another.
Indeed, the humanitarian situation in Syria before the earthquake was already catastrophic. Take into account, naturally, it was not because of sanctions only, because the country infrastructure and the country itself has been severely affected by 12 years of military hostilities on the territory of Syria. Due to the same hostilities, there were millions of migrants outside of Syria, and plus there were millions of internally displaced persons. And as you understand, take into account that these internally displaced person may have separated families. There could be children without documents. There could be people without any documents, people which have lost all their relatives. And that means that all of them need basic care. All of them sometimes need documents. And when it comes to children, many of them tend to be street children. That means that they do not even know the difference between good and evil. And they do not know the basic standards of population. That means that all of them somehow shall be rehabilitated back to the society. As from the infrastructure in Syria was enormously affected by the military hostilities first, and secondly by the impact of unilateral sanctions, because as I have mentioned, any efforts to rebuild Syria infrastructure was prohibited by unilateral sanctions imposed over that. That basically means that all spheres like transportation, water supply, electricity, internet access, irrigation system, agricultural machinery, food production systems, and even medicine production system and pharmaceutical sphere, aviation system, we are severely affected. And in the situation when people are only able to have 1 hour per day electricity or 2 hours per day electricity, that means that the majority of the infrastructure they need is not functioning. Similar situation exists with supply of water. I'm not talking about the drinking water only. I'm talking about the water for sanitation, for example. I visited a school in the rural homes, and the school has just started to function. So for your understanding, that's a building which is affected by military hostilities. There were no windows no glass in the windows, and it can be very cold in winter. You could see pieces of armature, so pieces of iron rods, which just stick out of the windows. There is no possibility for heating, and anyway, heating won't help because you do not have any glass windows. And there was no possibility even to use the lavatory students because there was a place for lavatory, but there was no water in that lavatory. So there is no use for that. Similar situation exists in the hospitals. Due to the migration, there was a shortage of doctors. For example, I was reported that in many hospitals, there was no doctors for intensive therapy, what is enormously important in the aftermath of the earthquake. There were no anesthesiologists in many hospitals. That's why surgeries were very risky for people. There was a problem with equipment. For example, in cancer hospital in rural Damascus, I was reported, and that's a main cancer hospital, I was reported that the line for CT scanner is 6 months. It basically means that a patient with first stage cancer will up with third or the fourth stage by the moment when he or she is able to do her CT body scanning. Unfortunately, similar situation exists in all areas. With no electricity, there is a problem to proceed with food production, with agriculture, no possibility to buy spare parts. Poverty level in Syria at the moment of my visit was around 90%. The same amount of people were considered to be food insecure.
Well, Professor, we really appreciate you joining us and helping break all of this down in a terrible situation. But again, thank you for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
It's a pleasure for me. Thank you for inviting.
Well, we want to move on. Yeah, terrible situation. To the other side of this story, of course, which is Turkey, the epicenter there of the earthquake, where there's also quite a bit of devastation, of course, but also quite a bit going on in terms of people-centered relief efforts. And we are very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Borçak Ozulu, who is a member of the Communist Party of Turkey Council and also the Crisis Management Coordinating Desk of the TKP there in Turkey. Borçak, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting us.
The first question I have is If you could just give us a sense of the scale of the devastation there in Turkey, and also something about the relief efforts that I know the TKP is mounting.
On the 6th of February, there were two big earthquakes on the same day. First, at the very early hours of the 6th of February on Monday, it was the magnitude 7.7, and then in the afternoon there was another one, again a very big magnitude of 7.6. And that earthquake was on the fault line of the southeast region of Turkey. And it affected 10 provinces, and it affected 1/6 of the whole population of Turkey. That makes the population of Turkey is above 885 million people. So it was a very, very big in scale. But it was not only that, that natural disaster, which was already big in scale, and it was a very intense disaster. It affected 10 provinces, and hundreds of thousands of buildings were collapsed. And the death toll is estimated to be over 100,000 of people dead. So that was a really, really big, very intense disaster for Turkey, or the people of Turkey.
I'm curious, many of people. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, finish. Go ahead.
No. I'm just trying to explain the magnitude of that disaster by just explaining 10 provinces with actually some cities already totally collapsed. Buildings are collapsed. The total infrastructure is destroyed. The schools, hospitals, and some public buildings, administrative buildings, are also destroyed or collapsed. So that was actually some of the cities are now erased already from the maps of that region. So that was how big the earthquake and how hard it hit the country. And you asked how the relief efforts actually started. For the first couple of hours in that region, the earthquake region, there were already no government intervention, no official people were there. As one of the political parties, which were actually working for people, trying to be in solidarity with people, Communist Party of Turkey has actually took action from the first hours of the earthquake. We have arranged a pioneer group to actually discover what happened in the region. And that was a group which already also consisted of a team for search and rescue, and a team for actually discovering and just preparing our relief centers or solidarity centers there. And when we arrived at the region, we couldn't see any other officials to help people there, or to just intervene the big disaster. So that the whole thing actually started in the region with individual effort, with efforts of some political parties, some groups of people, or some civil society people. And it's still going on like that. So there is no organized intervention from the the government. We cannot see any official state intervention or help or relief effort at the region now.
And I just want to mention that an hour ago, there was a 5.2 magnitude earthquake in central Turkey, which I felt here in Beirut, Lebanon. So obviously these aftershocks are continuing and continuing probably to cause some damage as well, especially with these very fragile buildings. But, you know, many people in the media are referring to this as a natural disaster. And indeed, an earthquake is a natural disaster. But did the policies of the AKP government contribute at all to the scale of the tragedy?
Sure, that is a natural disaster for sure, but the natural dimension is now almost negligible. The all urbanization policies, which were actually led by the liberal market rules, the unequal and unjust social of the country, the whole construction sector became the biggest capitalist power in the country, actually led this disaster. So all the cities have collapsed because of that unjust, irrational policies of the government. So that the earthquake was very big in magnitude, but the whole urbanization policies, the whole lack of the government intervention actually made it a more deep and intense disaster for the people of the region and of Turkey in total.
You know, one of the other things I'm curious about along similar lines is, in the context of your relief efforts, have there been bureaucratic obstacles? I mean, have the government's own actions made it more difficult to provide relief?
TKP now actually holds 7 solidarity centers on the region, and we are providing aid there. We had some search and rescue operations as well. And the materials are transferred there. And actually, the absolute absence of the government becomes an obstacle. Because TKP, by its very organized and full of solidarity feelings, intervention helps people there, but there are no other governmental responsible points. So our party actually does more than it has to. So there are no bureaucratic obstacles. There is an absolute absence of bureaucracy. No any official points. No health service. No policing, no security, no relief services are organized. They have sources. The Turkish government have sources, but they cannot just organize them. Maybe because they don't want to. And instead of being obstacles, we are now actually asking them to have the responsibility to do what they have to do, so that we will take the responsibility to build that solidarity, to help our people, but not actually try to fulfill what the government has to do.
There's so many, because of the war in Syria, there's so many refugees, especially in southern Syria, where this earthquake, or at least one of the earthquakes, left so much devastation. So what has been the impact of this disaster on the refugees that live in Turkey?
The most of the Syrian refugees in the country lives in that area of Turkey, and they had already very poor conditions. They had very poor infrastructures in their buildings. So of course, they were also affected very badly in that region, and also the refugees, the Syrian refugees, and their conditions are actually abused by some of the reactionary ideologies in the country. So they are trying to point them as being the scapegoats of some unorganized issues in some very critical social issues. So the refugees and the refugee camps are also affected very badly, and they cannot receive any, if there is any relief in that region. So they are in a very, very poor condition as well as the other population of the country.
Finally, one thing I just wanted to ask is, in very much in the context of everything you said so far, I mean, what does this disaster say about the sort of changes that are needed in Turkey more broadly to make society, more equal, more just? Obviously, you can't prevent earthquakes, but at least to make the unnatural part of what happened a thing of the past.
I think there may be one good thing about that big disaster for our people. The people in Turkey have discovered solidarity. The people of Turkey have discovered the importance of being united, being organized, and have discovered the importance of a very strong state of people. So that will actually help for our appeal for build a new future. And TKP also just very recently released an appeal for the people to actually gain back our country, an appeal for standing up for building a just, a secular, an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist country, not to be buried once again under this type of a debris.
Mm-hmm. Solidarity is stronger than an earthquake, I believe, is the slogan. Really amazing work that you all have going on there. Again, Borçak Ozulu from the TKP Party Council. It's the Communist Party of Turkey and their Crisis Management Coordination Desk. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding.
I also want to note, for those who are here in the United States, I don't have the exact link I was looking for, but the People's Forum, where I'm currently recording from, is collecting donations for supporting these people-centered solidarity relief efforts, and you can go to their social media, the People's Forum, and there's some links there. You can also go to my personal social media where I've tweeted it out. It's at Eugene Per Year. A couple days ago, you can find it there. You can also find some links to the TKP, Communist Party of Turkey's feeds that are showing the work that they're doing on a regular basis. So I can absolutely assure you, if you make a donation through the People's Forum, it will actually get to people on the ground, and you'll be able to follow and share that very important work.
Indeed. And also just a reminder that because of sanctions on Syria, it's almost impossible to do something similar, to even organize like a GoFundMe campaign. I believe a GoFundMe campaign that somebody tried to do from Germany was shut down.
Yes, I don't think you can even put Syria. You definitely can in PayPal or Venmo. So yeah, it's pretty dire.
Yeah.
Whew, terrible situation. Well, we're going to turn the page here now and move to another very important global situation. That's the situation of Iran and China, and also, of course, some of the just broader issues around Iran. And we are very, very happy to be joined by Mazda Majidi, who is a longtime anti-war activist and an organizer with the Answer Coalition. Mazda, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Eugene. Great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. Couple things that we want to touch on here. I think maybe the first thing is just, I think the story a lot of people have seen in the news, that is President Raisi of Iran just wrapped up his visit to China with President Xi. I mean, maybe give us some context for this visit. I mean, how important is it, and how important are the things that they decided?
I think, Eugene, it's very, very significant. It's a lot more important than a typical head of state visit and signing a few contracts and agreements. To give a little background, in 2021, a few weeks before, a few months before the end of the Rouhani administration, President Rouhani, the previous administration, previous to Raisi, Iran and China signed an agreement of friendship and cooperation. Um, the agreement itself lacked very many specifics, but it was seen as a significant turn on the part of Tehran towards more friendly relations with China. As you might expect, the right wing in Iran, and much of it, basically hosted radio stations and TV stations in Europe and in the US and Canada and so forth, started this huge campaign against it. They started saying things like, Iran is giving parts of its land, some of its islands, control of its ports and so forth to China. In fact, I personally, at the time, to be able to counter all of those accusations, I had to read the thing word by word, and there's very few specifics. But after that, the Iranian state, of course, there was a new president elected and so forth, but progress on materializing some of the points of friendship and cooperation was slow until in October, when a Chinese delegation, it wasn't so much a diplomatic delegation, it was mostly trade experts and kind of technical people and so forth, visited Tehran. And now, so the culmination of this whole process is now Raisi visiting Beijing, meeting with Xi Jinping, and there's at least 10 contracts, apparently large contracts signed. The details of the agreements have not been made public so much, but I think more important than the specific economic and trade agreements is the fact that, in view of the U.S. sanctions very likely not going anywhere, Tehran is pivoting towards more relations, closer relations with China.
No, it's quite significant. And then also, I mean, we can come back to the issue of China as well, but another thing that coincided was, of course, the anniversary of the Islamic Revolution in 1979. And there was a big showing. It didn't get that much attention in U.S. media, if any. I'm wondering if there was anything particularly significant about this year. I mean, one thing that comes to mind is, the U.S. and all the Western countries very much believed that after the death of Masa Amini and the protests that took place in the aftermath of that this somehow meant, the end of the regime, the end of the Islamic Republic. And obviously this shows that it wasn't, but I'm curious your thoughts on this recent sort of showing of celebration of the revolution.
You're right. The recent showing was absolutely surprising, not just to those who want to overthrow the Islamic Republic, but even the supporters. For people who may not be familiar with the history, February 11th, every year, except for the COVID years, but other than that, every year, there's been demonstrations of supporters of the revolution, and usually it's well attended, but this year, I think the turnout exceeded expectations of everyone. I mean, the state estimated overall the number of demonstrators at 21 million. Even if we dismiss that as an exaggeration, if you see the aerial footage of demonstrations in many, many cities, I saw one report, 50 minutes, all it was coverage of demonstrations in Tehran, 50 other cities. There were huge demonstrations, even smaller areas. To be honest with you, there were names that I haven't even heard of, and there were significant demonstrations there. So this demonstration, it wasn't covered in the West, as you said, but for a good reason, because the narrative here is that the Islamic Republic regime is on the verge of collapse, and everyone wants it overthrown. And, of course, showing how many millions of people demonstrated in support of the revolution is not something that they want to, shed any light on. By the way, to the extent that there was any coverage, it was kind of mixed in with other stuff. Like one report said, people demonstrate in Tehran amid massive protests against the regime. And the so-called massive protests were protests of 15 or 20 or 25 people. And then the millions who marched, there's not, even the term mass protest doesn't apply to it. Interestingly, also, because the Iranian state media finally are becoming a little sharper on dealing with the propaganda from the outside that's sure to come in. I saw one report, huge demonstrations in Tehran, where every reporter was saying that the date, the location, the exact location, the intersection, the date, and so forth, as if they knew that some of the pro-imperialist sources abroad are going to say, "Oh, this is just footage, historical archives, and so forth." But that has very much, to anyone watching, if anyone is watching beyond BBC Farsi and the Saudi-funded Iran International and so forth, this was very significant, because if we somehow believed all of the propaganda that the Islamic Republic was about to be overthrown by this mass protest movement, the 44th anniversary demonstration took care of that illusion.
Well, I'm glad you brought that last point too, Mazda, because it does feel that there's sort of an intersection of these two stories, right? I mean, I think, President Raisi going to China, and I should say at the request of President Xi, this is after a couple months after, of course, Xi goes to Saudi Arabia and has this huge meeting with, many of the Arab states, and people are saying, is China turning its back on Iran? And then, of course, the protest, and they're saying, oh, the people are rising up. And the sort of cross-section is, the way it's presented is, Iran is forever on the brink, forever teetering, that it doesn't really have any mass support. So just going to take that one gust of wind. I mean, you often travel to Iran. I know that you were there relatively recently. I mean, give us a sense of where people are on the ground in Iran. I mean, how people are feeling, because it just seems that what we hear on the outside is very different. It seems to me, at least, from the average Iranian's, point of view, regardless of, whatever this or that issue.
That's very true, Eugene. And I was last there in late September and October, in the middle of the supposed revolution. I have to say, and this has been true since the 2009 elections, what has to be emphasized is that a significant part of the population, it is not the majority, but certainly northern Tehran, where affluent people live, and also similar affluent neighborhoods in some of the other big cities, Isfahan, Shiraz, Mashhad, Tabriz, and others, are for the overthrow of the Islamic Revolution. Not only that, they're really either pro-Shah or pro-US or pro-European imperialists, or any combination thereof. That is very true. But this sector of the population likes to think that their views and their preferences represents all of Iran. In part, that is because the pro-imperialist coverage of satellite TV channels that are, I can tell you from experience, unfortunately, from many of my family members, that those stations are running 24/7. But these stations make it sound as if there is no other part of the population. I mean, when I say that the huge march of millions in support of the revolution caught many by surprise, I'm not even just talking about people abroad. I'm talking about people within Iran who watch the coverage of the pro-imperialist media so much that they're actually convinced, oh, everybody wants the Islamic Republic to be overthrown. And they typically dismiss the other part of the population, which is probably much more numerous and certainly much more active in terms of demonstrating and being politically active. But this sector that wants the overthrow of the Islamic Republic likes to think of itself as representing the entire population, and everyone else being either agents of the Islamic Republic or the videos being fake and all this kind of stuff. But it is polarized very much along class lines. Like if you talk to people in southern Tehran, the working class neighborhoods, which I did and I do on every one of my trips, and if you go to the provinces, especially small towns and other places, people, I mean, they do have to deal with the hardships as a result of the sanctions and inflation and so forth, but they are very much for the revolution. And if you talk to the people in northern Tehran, it is extremely right-wing. And it's to some people who call themselves progressive in the West and support the quote, revolution in Iran right now, which is the right-wing movement, I say, if you sit in the conversations of these people who are, for the overthrow of the Islamic Republic, you'd be ashamed of yourself. I mean, the right-wing views among this sector of the population would put the likes of Trump to shame.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point that's never mentioned about both the media, but much of which that satellite media is funded by like the Saudis or the Americans or the Germans or the actual ideas that mostly middle and upper middle class people who are the base that are watching have. But, since you were there recently, I'm curious, a lot of people always ask, well, we heard that the guidance patrol in Iran has been, I don't know if it's been disbanded, but it's basically like not really active or enforcing the hijab mandate anymore. Has that changed since the protests did start? Because I think one thing that people forget to understand is that if there's social progress to be made in Iran, there are people in Iran having these conversations, and it's really up to them to make that progress, not for people from outside to impose it.
That is absolutely a valid question. I want to say, measuring the progress that women have made in the Iranian Revolution, as well as in other places, is a multifaceted question. And the right wing wants to make it all come down to the one issue of the hijab or the veil, and they do gross exaggerations of how tightly it is enforced. It is enforced very loosely, but you're right in terms of the morality squads, or whatever you want to call them, who are not even armed, by the way, and they haven't killed anyone or roughed up anyone in their history. But they're either not active at all or quite inactive. There's been a lot of discussions, as you say, among the people in the Majlis or the parliament about whether to disband them altogether or, what to do. I want to say also that a part of the population, this is not the mullahs or the statespeople pushing it. A part of the population with deep beliefs in the revolution and its religious tenets wants the morality squads to continue. But for now, they are less active. And I want to say, I know we don't have that much time, but even the basis of the demonstrations in terms of the morality squads having killed somebody was false. It came out with undisputed evidence that Mahsa Amini was suffering from brain issues, brain tumors that had been operated on, and she was visiting doctors all the time. She did die in custody. Well, 3 days after she was in the center, she died in a hospital, but it really had nothing to do with her being roughed up or beaten up or anything like that. It's the history of her illness, unfortunately. And I'm talking about documents from her visits, from the doctors who had operated on her. All of this stuff was provided by the state. But of course, none of this stuff made it to the Saudi and US and British funded media outlets. So the narrative here is, oh, she was killed by the police.
Mm-hmm. No, it's so many points I want to make here, but it's, it's funny. There's that. I would call it Israeli propaganda show Tehran on Apple TV. And it's just funny because the whole premise of that show is how basically you can do whatever you want. And it's even though there's some repression, people are doing whatever. So it's just funny that even in that kind of propaganda reality, a lot of the myths, about what life is like in Iran are busted. But putting that show aside, which I have many thoughts about, one other thing I wanted to ask you about, Mazda, since you're there, is the economic situation. Because, in the last presidential campaign in Iran, which I was following pretty closely, the number one issue was improving the economic situation. There's a lot of criticism of the Rouhani administration for being too neoliberal. Everyone in every debate was trying to outdo themselves with how many jobs they were going to create, how many houses they were going to build. So there was a real sense that to me at least, that the drift was towards addressing working class issues more forthrightly, and that's what people wanted, and that's partially why President Raisi was able to win. Were you able to get any sense on your trip of where some of that stands?
Yeah, I think in some of the different factions, the two main different factions, when they go all at it, it becomes even harder to get an exact view of what's going on. It is true that the Raisi administration is less neoliberal, for the lack of a better word. But neoliberal, we're talking about, an economy that's 60% owned by the state, and the neoliberal ones are the ones who want to do some privatizations. Iran is not in danger of being, broken up into pieces and being sold to international corporations. But in terms of the Raisi administration, he has shown an inclination to implement some, working class, some policies to benefit the working class. Again, I'm not saying that the Rouhani administration didn't do any of that, but it seems to be a little bit more under Raisi. But I have to emphasize the sanctions are huge. For the listeners or the viewers, we have to emphasize this is not sanctions just saying that, Iran cannot trade with the US. These are sanctions where every entity, whether it be a state or a company or a corporation trading with Iran, will be penalized in the billions by the US. And because of the role of the dollar in international trade, it is very hard to get away from it. So the economy is in some level of, it is functional, things are available, but inflation is very high. And I think the possible pivot towards China is an indication that the Raisi administration, and not just him, Khamenei and the whole leadership, I think they have probably lost or are very close to completely losing hope on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, of the potential lifting of the sanctions as a result of reaching another agreement. And so therefore, I think another significance of the Raisi trip at the invitation of Xi, as you said, Eugene, is probably more long-term than a temporary thing. I'll just say this. It seems very unlikely now that the JCPOA will be resumed, even though it was, Trump that illegally got out of the agreement when there was no out clause in the agreement. But the US, I don't think, is going to sign it. And from Iran's perspective, many entities, including the Revolutionary Guard, have been added to the sanctions since the 2015 agreement. So you're going to sign the agreement and still be sanctioned because of the large role that the Revolutionary Guard play in the construction projects and so forth. It seems unlikely, and I think Iran has seen the need to pivot towards China for meeting its economic needs. Already the leading trade partner in terms of the number one destination for export of Iranian products, and the number two source of imports is China. So there's already vast economic relations, but they're likely to expand far beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Mazda Majidi from the Answer Coalition, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Like the dog had to have its
gotta have the last word.
Say, yeah,
Our canine
totally.
friends. Well, we want to go to our next guest, who we kept waiting a little bit here, who we are very honored to be joined by always. That's Zoe Alexandra, journalist and co-editor of People's Dispatch, who's joining us to talk about a few things happening in Latin America. Zoe, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thanks for having me. Excited for this little trip across South America.
Well, excellent. Zoe, Rania, and Eugene's excellent adventure. Let's start with something positive, since I just did it that way. Ecuador, where we have seen some electoral setbacks in the left in the past couple years, just saw some big turnarounds here. There were recent elections, I believe, for both governors and mayoralities. Tell us, Zoe, what took place there.
Well, yes, there were elections that took place on February 5th, and major gains for the Citizens' Revolution movement. As you said, there have been several electoral setbacks, but also a very, very fierce lawfare campaign against, of course, the Citizen Revolution's leader, Rafael Correa. He's essentially been banned from even returning to Ecuador, which has severely weakened the movement. Of course, he was president of the country for many years. In this context, after the candidate of Rafael Correa, Andrés Arauz, lost the elections in 2021, to Guillermo Lasso, who's just kind of the representative of everything of the neoliberal system. He's a banker, very deeply involved in putting forth a lot of these neoliberal policies. There has been a reconstruction of the left, and that's what we saw in these elections on February 5th. They gained many important mayor's offices, specifically of Pichincha, and other major cities, Guayas as well. And in addition to these electoral victories, there's also just been a serious political setbacks for Guillermo Lasso. This week, there was a report published by a local media outlet which revealed serious corruption allegations that could be taking place with people very close to his government. So Lasso's really on the back foot. Conservatives, which thought they had been able to kind of beat back the citizens' revolution at the polls and kind of weaken them with lawfare campaigns, putting people in prison or charging them with corruption, is now seeing that not only is it going to be defeated in the polls like it just was in these local elections, but also there's a lot of information coming out that points to very, very high people in this government having actual links to corruption, which is, of course, what they accuse the leftists of having.
So, Zoe, I want to move to a different country now on our little journey, and that is the country of Peru, where there have been repressive protests. You were actually on the ground not that long ago reporting on those protests. Many people have been killed in the aftermath of the essentially the overthrow of Pedro Castillo. Can you update us on what's happening in Peru?
Definitely. Well, as you said, it's a very tumultuous situation. It's been a little over 2 months since Pedro Castillo was overthrown in a legislative coup in the country. And since then, there's been complete unrest on the streets of the capital, of major cities and provinces in the south specifically. As you said, the repression has been something that's, I think, really unprecedented. Over 60 people have been killed. Some reports say it could be over 70. There's people with extremely, extremely serious injuries. And a lot of the people who have been killed were actually killed with firearms from members of the army, from members of the national police. So we're not talking about impacts from tear gas canisters. We're talking about live bullets being shot from security forces at protesters. And as you've covered on the show, I'm pretty sure that the major demands of the people on the streets who have been on the streets for really 2 months at this point is for Dina Boluarte, who's the de facto president of this coup-installed regime, really, to say it that way, that she resign, that the right-wing Congress, which has a 90% disapproval rating, that this Congress be dissolved, that immediate elections be held in this year, in 2023, that Pedro Castillo be released. Many are calling for his restitution as president, saying that his removal was illegal. And one of the biggest demands is holding a constituent assembly. And the response of the government for 2 months has been to deny all of these demands, has been to kill people, has been to repress, has been to put people in prison. There's many, many cases that have been opened up against leftist leaders, progressive leaders, human rights activists. Journalists have been targeted, have been specifically targeted by police. Their equipment has been confiscated. I mean, it's a really serious situation. And of course, the response of the Organization of the American States and the US government has been essentially to turn a blind eye, to release, after maybe 15 people are killed in one day, they say, oh, that shouldn't happen. That's not great. They should really try to preserve the life of the people. But in terms of actually any measures against Dina Boluarte or any strong condemnation of her government, there's essentially been zilch. The leaders across the continent have been extremely important in terms of denouncing this violence and denouncing the actions of her government. And in return, a lot of them have actually been banned from entering the country, which is an interesting development.
Wow. Well, serious ongoing situation. I just want to mention, among many other superlatives I could add, Zoe is the co-editor of People's Dispatch, where all of this is being covered quite frequently on a very updated basis. Another issue that's obviously roiling Latin America and that roils the whole region really is the impact of U.S. sanctions. One of the most sanctioned countries is Nicaragua, allegedly for so-called human rights abuses, but of course we see countries like El Salvador, like Guatemala, with, I think you could say it's way worse, not the same thing. So it's obviously somewhat political. But some major developments here, 200 individuals were released from prison, so-called political prisoners from the United States, says the United States government. They came to the U.S., and then Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, had a phone call with the foreign minister of Nicaragua, Denis Moncada, which is, there's almost no communication between the two governments. So this was a pretty big thing in terms of, I don't know what it potentially could mean. Maybe just tell us a little bit more, Zoe, about what took place there, and whether or not that perhaps portends some changes in how the U.S. is approaching the left-leaning governments in Latin America.
Well, it's definitely an interesting development. People who have been accused by the Nicaraguan government of participating in the failed coup attempt in 2018 for stoking what they classify as terrorist violence, for committing acts against the nation. Some are even accused of treason. For that reason, they had been in prison and such now been deported to the United States. And this is an interesting development, as you said, not only in terms of, well, the U.S. actually opening up communication with the country, which it's had extremely harsh words against, but also I think it's indicative of the different ways that these countries are grappling with these counter-revolutionary attacks on the government. How do you actually deal with this? How do you bring justice? This is one example. We've seen different versions in Bolivia, in Venezuela, because, you know, what to do with these people that actually participate in such violent and such disruptive protests. In this case, they said, we're returning you to the people who are paying you, and that's the U.S. government, which was an interesting, very on-the-nose move. But yeah, I think you're exactly right that this does indicate that the U.S. is realizing that it has to have a different attitude towards the region. Before, Nicaragua was surrounded by Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was, you know, a far-right big friend of the U.S. And to the south, he had, you know, far-right government in Colombia. That has changed. Now you have Xiomara Castro to the north, who's really about integration, has been an extremely active member in forums like CELAC, and has really been advocating for an end to U.S. imperialism in the region. So I think they're realizing that they can no longer actually have this hostile and antagonistic attitude when the region itself is coming together and saying, we have differences, we have different political ideologies, we have different political systems, but at the end of the day, we have to work together for our common good. And I think the U.S. is realizing that they can no longer attempt to divide and conquer with regards to these more socialist-leaning governments and states. So that's why we're seeing kind of rapprochement measures, even with Cuba, despite the fact not lifting all of the sanctions and the blockade, and of course not removing it from the U.S. sponsors of terrorism list. That being said, they're still taking some minimal efforts towards warming relations in some way. With Venezuela, again, there's definitely some progress in the relationship there. So I think this can also be kind of classified as part of this this general warming towards these countries.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zoe, just before we let you go, let folks know where they can find People's Dispatch. And since it is Thursday, let them know where they can also find the Give the People What They Want show from People's Dispatch.
Well, you can find us on all social media platforms at People's Dispatch. And every Friday, we host a very fun news roundup show with our great friend, Vijay Prashad, and with myself and Prashant, who's the other co-editor of People's Dispatch. Another kind of world tour situation of the weekly news, 30 minutes, tune in. You can find that on our YouTube page. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for having you on. I hope thanks for coming on. Jesus Christ. I hope everybody checks out Give the People What They Want. It's almost like an Olympic sport, the way you guys cover so many different issues there.
It really
every week on Friday mornings. But thanks again for giving us some of your time here.
Thanks.
Well, Rania, I want to just say that there's some breaking news, some pretty disappointing or sad breaking news coming out of Washington, D.C. Senator John Fetterman from Pennsylvania, who of course many people know had a stroke, has now been hospitalized for clinical depression, which apparently has gotten very severe. So
that's
disappointing
very
thing there.
unfortunate.
But yeah, very difficult. This article in the New York Times about the difficulties he's been facing and trying to transition after a stroke. And however you might feel about any political party, I think this is an important story for all of us, who have had family members or other people who may have had strokes and other things like that. The recovery process can be very, very difficult. You lose a lot of your functions. You have to rebuild them. It can be very frustrating. Whole parts of your life can be over. And a lot of people do suffer from mental health and exaggerated mental health issues, not exaggerated in a bad way, but if they have mental health issues, they can be exacerbated, I should say, by this. Right. So an important thing, I think, for us to remember about the impact of strokes on people. So Senator John Fetterman hospitalized for clinical depression. We've got a few minutes until our next guest. So there's all sorts of things that we could talk about, Rania, none of which I've planned to talk about with you, so I don't know where you want to take it, but I don't know if you noticed that the former UN ambassador to the United Nations for the United States, former governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, has announced she's challenging Donald Trump, the only other person in the race for the Republican nomination, some challenges saying I guess she would kick people with their heels, other countries or something like that, like Russia, so some very violent kind of situation. She had Pastor John Hagee, this just totally out there right-wing pastor who was there at her kickoff. She was taking a shot at black people in the thing about, having a different approach to race. I mean, there's so many things I could say about it. I didn't really, prepare that much for it, but she's in the race. She's obviously a very high-profile figure. It's dominating the political news here in the United States, although no one thinks she has much of a chance to win. But she doesn't. I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I mean, my thoughts are that I think Nikki Haley is a horrible person. I think she really is. I mean, I think when in her position, she was one of the most vile UN ambassadors the U.S. has ever had. She's a hardcore neoconservative who has very terrible plans for the world. Not that, any American imperialist doesn't have terrible plans for the world, but she's really a special case. And I think she's delusional to think that she can fire up the MAGA base at all. Like, it's just not going to happen. She did a really good job of this balancing act when she was serving under Donald Trump of appeasing and pleasing him while also seeming to be this figure that the liberal media could celebrate as, oh, she's one of the reasonable people in his administration. She did quite a good job of that, but that's about all she appeals to. Yeah. Is the sort of centrist media types who want a more acceptable Republican candidate. Beyond that, I really don't think that she can bring together any sort of Republican base that can make her the nominee. I really think it's she's quite young actually. She's quite young. I think she's in her 50s. So this could just be her, running the first time because that's what people do. The candidate, they run, a few times. Sometimes they run every 4 years to try to win over some sort of base, win over donors for the next time around. So I think she's playing the long game, but she's a really dangerous figure.
I agree. I think that for sure she also might be looking for the vice president. But yeah, I think the point you make there is very true. Is the Republican Party constantly looking for a more acceptable face on just totally execrable policies. So that's Nikki Haley I see there at the bottom. We'll see if she does fail. Also, a flip flopper, I have to say, Mitt Romney style. She was for Trump, against Trump, for Trump, against Trump.
Well, she's good. She's doing it's self-preservation, but I was going to say, I think she also might end up making a vice presidential candidate. If this is something that she kind of talked to the Trump people about beforehand, but who knows? We'll see.
Yes, indeed. Well, we're going to move to our next guest. Editor-in-Chief of Breakthrough News, Ben Becker, is joining us to discuss everything regarding balloons.
Doctor.
He's a father.
Dr. Ben Becker.
And a doctor. So he knows all about balloons. All about balloons. Ben, thank you for joining us. Oh, you're muted. You're muted. No.
We have no idea what he just said. He could have just been throwing insults at us, and we just didn't have a clue.
Are you there?
Can he hear us?
No, we can't hear you. Well, he's probably regaling us with stories of lost balloons at the park. If you're a parent, I feel you have some knowledge of balloons. We'll come. Are you back?
Yes.
There
we go. Dr. Ben Becker, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I do have many balloons in my car at the moment. It's a true driving hazard in the rearview mirror when they're flying around
Yeah.
with sparkly balloons.
Well, thanks so much for
Balloons?
joining us, Ben. Happy to have you here. Obviously, President Biden spoke today saying that most of the recent shoot downs of these balloons they were nothing, that they were not any danger at all, that some of them, of course, they were not China, some of them were like private people and research institutions. There's so much going on around this, Ben, in terms of the balloon angle. And I guess my question for you is twofold. I mean, one, maybe it's one question. Does it even really matter what the purpose of this balloon was? Because some people are saying it's a spy balloon, it's not a spy balloon, but it seems like kind of either whether it is or whether it isn't, the general thrust seems very similar, that the response was totally out of proportion with whatever it was alleged to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's a true sign of the times that a balloon could lead us into the great unknown of shooting down unidentified objects, potentially linked to other nuclear armed states, then beating your chest about it, bragging about it in the State of the Union that we defended our national sovereignty. That was Joe Biden's exact quote, because everyone knows our sovereignty was threatened by the balloon. And in fact, I believe John Kirby, the National Security Council guy, he said, we decided, even though we didn't know what those last three objects were, the ones they shot down in rapid succession over the weekend, he said, we decided to shoot them down out of an abundance of caution. So shooting things with, missiles and Raytheon jets that you don't know what they are and who they belong to, where they're going to land, all those things, and then just basically asking questions later if you can find the material on the ground or in the water, which it took them many days to find a lot of it, that's an abundance of caution. That's where we are in the world. That the cautious thing to do is just to start firing your guns up into the air and shooting stuff down without knowing what it is. I mean, I think it's reflective of where we are in terms of this so-called major power conflict. Once they've declared this to be the strategy of the United States, and they have, that is the official national security doctrine of this government, major power conflict preparation for major war with Russia or China or Russia and China. That is the official military doctrine. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because once you've said that, then anything that happens, and there's always accidents and weird things and flukes that happen, no politician, they've put themselves in a corner. They all are seen as weak if they, try to say something rational, like maybe this isn't a big deal. Maybe it is a spy balloon that's gone off track. Maybe it's a weather balloon, but do we really want to create an international high stakes incident out of this? No, you can't ask that question. You can't even ask that question. You can't say, well, how many spy balloons do we have over China and Russia? Or what about the space race, where, the explicit purpose of the Space Force, which we have in this country, a Space Force, is to basically spy on every other country. So, any kind of rational discourse, and you're just weak. You're weak. And it's going back to this new Cold War theme, which again becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and an extremely dangerous one.
Yeah, it did. Watching some of the news coverage, it did seem to be priming the American public for the idea that China invaded America. That is the perception you get from watching CNN or MSNBC or Fox News talk about what, by the way, was actually a balloon. At first, I thought the word balloon was just a word they were using for some big ship, because I was like, surely this can't all be over an actual balloon. And then I saw images of it. It's an actual balloon.
It is.
They were freaking out over was actually a balloon. They're shooting actual balloons out of the sky.
Heroically.
It's kind of,
they heroically shot balloons out of the sky.
Heroically.
Our
But
boys,
Ben,
the Air Force.
On some level, it does seem to me like some of the really exaggerated, just ridiculous reactions that we saw in the media and among certain officials was kind of a reflection of certain anxieties from U.S. elites about China's rise. as a economic powerhouse, as a well-respected country. I mean, you could see it in what Biden said at the State of the Union. We played that clip last week of what Biden was like, saying, who in the world would even want to be Xi Jinping? And we're like, actually, a lot of people would, because it's a really like well-run and powerful country. But the point is, like, what do you think this says about the mentality of a lot of our elites right now when it comes to the issue of China? There do seem to be a lot of anxieties there that were playing out over the last couple of weeks.
I think part of it is genuine anxiety about the eclipse of the United States in a multipolar world. Definitely. I mean, I think that's an underlying anxiety. I think there's also a high degree of demagogy where they know this is just a balloon and it is prepping, like you said. So, I mean, I agree with both your points, honestly. It was portrayed basically that the U.S. had been invaded, that our sovereignty had been, compromised, and that who knows what they're getting with our military sites. I alluded to it before, but the U.S. has already invested tens of millions of dollars in their own balloons, their own high-altitude spy balloons that are aimed at Russia and China. Basically, everything the U.S. military does at this point has some strategic use against Russia and China. Every technology they're developing, everything. It's similar to the old Cold War, where even civilian technologies and military technologies, it's all based on basically the competition with China. And now people are talking about like a balloon gap. Like, is there a balloon gap? There used to be a missile gap with the Soviet Union, and that was a very powerful operating principle in terms of defense funding, the military-industrial complex, the sort of fear-mongering that was constant in the United States, that the U.S. was going to be overtaken by the Soviet Union. I mean, it turned out that the Soviet Union in almost all basic areas was still behind the United States. It was coming from a much lower base, although in certain areas, as we know with Sputnik, they had surpassed the United States. And this becomes sort of an engine for this kind of discourse that the United States is about to be ruined. So there's a long history of this, and it's a very powerful sentiment, and that people then sort of opportunistically jump on for one reason or another. Whether it's genuine anxiety or not, it becomes the way you secure funding. It's the way you shape politics. Obviously, some people were probably happy to see Blinken cancel his trip to China. But even Blinken's trip to China, I don't think it's true that what the Wall Street Journal is saying, that this was actually some trip that was actually going to seriously improve U.S.-China relations. I think that was a trip to really throw China off balance because they recognized that having just complete opposition to China pushes China further and further into the arms of Russia. They have to have sort of more sophisticated tactics as they manage this moment where the unipolar era is ending. So they're using a lot of different tactics, and then this balloon comes along, and basically the Biden administration is being attacked by the right wing, the far right, as being weak or even captured, Manchurian candidates, blah, 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 captured by China. And the only way to prove that you're not a Chinese agent is to just shoot it down out of the sky. But to your point, Rania, if they had done this 10 or 15 years ago when there were sort of better relations with China and they weren't in this new Cold War framework, do you really think they would have shot down the balloon? I don't think so. I think that China would have issued some apology. They would have said, sorry about that. It went off course. They would have just tried to diminish it because they recognized that at that time, China was extremely valuable for the United States. So that's how they thought of it, and that they were trying to have better relations with the Chinese leadership. Now, having declared that they basically want to overthrow the Chinese government and its political leadership, China can do nothing right. And every incident, no matter how small, can be easily inflamed to become a major world issue. And it's, again, this is the self-fulfilling prophecy. It's way bigger than whether the balloon was a spy balloon or whether it was a weather balloon. Because as we said, every state, even allies, spy on each other. There's who knows how many thousands of things flying around in the sky and near space and stratosphere and of course outer space. So if you want to make an international incident, it'd be very easy to just start, shooting in the sky and shooting down everybody's stuff.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I'm glad you brought up the issue of such a long history of these pretexts. Of course, the missile gap, the famous Team B exercises, where the CIA said there is no missile gap, and in fact, we're well ahead of the Soviet Union in every defense area. George H.W. Bush is then made the head of the CIA, and he brings in a team of outside experts, many of the neocons that would actually later appear in the Iraq War effort, who then just produce a completely separate report saying, actually, we're way behind the Soviet Union and everything. And that kicks off the whole new arms race that then is really fueled by the Reagan administration in a major way. And I think the pretext issue is an important issue because at the same time we're talking about this, there is the stories coming out that President Biden is preparing the largest ever defense budget, quote unquote defense budget, let's call it a war budget, in history. So it does seem that to some degree the timing here is, interestingly coincidental.
It is. There's an element of unreality about this whole thing. I mean, as if China is encircling the United States, as if China is, investing everything in the overthrow of the U.S. government. That's like the stated policy, basically, of the U.S. policy is regime change of this country and preparing all of those $800 billion that's on the books war money, plus the other $300 or $400 billion, the real war budget, which is over $1 trillion. Now, almost all of it is devoted to Russia and China. So if you were in Russia and China, you might actually want to know a little bit more about that military technology that's aimed at wiping out your country and taking out your leadership. And then the idea that they're spying on us, it's like we're the victims. The United States is the victims all of a sudden. There's an air of unreality where you kind of have to, it assumes, the premise of it is that you basically see the United States as the good actor and everyone else as the bad actor throughout the whole world. You have to know nothing about history, know nothing about geopolitics. And the main thing is just be very frightened when you look up in the sky that there's a balloon from a foreign country that hates us. And if you don't want to be scared, then you have to, basically allow another 2/3 of your tax dollars to go into the military industrial complex. But you know what really scares people in this country? I mean, there is very scary surveillance. It's like all around us. That's what I was thinking about throughout all this. Like, really? That's the surveillance story of the decade, the Chinese spy balloon? What about the balloon in Baltimore? Remember that, Eugene?
Yes.
That was a few years ago. And it matters to me because I'm from Baltimore. But the Baltimore Police Department put a balloon.
Oh, no, the plane. It was a plane. Persistent surveillance.
A blimp.
No, I thought, well, maybe there was two things. But there was a thing where they got the guy who did the persistent surveillance on Iraq by the U.S. military occupation, and he came to Baltimore and put up a plane that watched the entire city 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Okay, well, someone can fact check me. I think there was a blimp involved too.
It was probably
I remember
that too.
The Baltimore Police Department put up whatever these aircrafts were, and they
multiple
basically
aircraft,
cameras all over the base of it, taking nonstop video of every street in Baltimore, especially the high crime areas, tracking people's cars, their license plates, even their bodies, figuring out where they were going, their daily routes. And they did all of this without even the knowledge of the Baltimore mayor or the Baltimore City Council, so that they could, if a crime had been committed, could go back and roll the tape on the entire city. And no one in the city signed up for it, accepted that. That is the level of overwhelmingly constant state surveillance. And it's basically not a big issue. It never made it in the State of the Union address, I'll tell you that much. But this spy balloon, there's just an element of unreality about it. And I think that it came up in the socialist program, one of our other programs. And the phrase was this whole thing would be laughable, except it's actually very scary, the potential consequences of this kind of ignorance.
Yeah, I was living in Baltimore at the time, and what's amazing is when they got caught, they said, oh, well, we're actually doing this because we want to help solve police brutality. And because we can see every single thing happening in Baltimore, we're going to be able to get the dirty cops. I mean, that was really their justification,
Incredible.
But amazing. Sorry, Rania, I cut you off.
No, it's just incredible. It's also man, I can't get over the sovereignty, the violation of sovereignty element from a country that has 800 military bases. That's an underestimate, I think, by the way. I've heard it be as high as 1,000, but has military bases stationed all over the world. You mentioned the like militarization of space basically by the United States to spy on the entire world, that like barely even scratches the surface. Where, you know, it's like in the Edward Snowden NSA releases, we found out the US was like spying on its own allies and tapping their phones.
Yeah.
Not to mention the military bases, the US military bases that literally surround China. So if a Chinese weather balloon, Ben, is a violation of US sovereignty, whether it was a spy balloon or not, okay? Like let's be generous, okay? Let's say, okay, it was a balloon that was spying. Let's say it was. If that's a huge violation of sovereignty, then what do we call what the US is doing to the entire world?
Yeah, it's sovereignty is a completely hollow term when uttered from the lips of U.S. policymakers. I mean, are you kidding me? What are these unilateral sanctions all over? I mean, what we've been hearing in the show today. I mean, what international law or even national sovereignty is respected ever by the United States? It's like everything is flipped on its head, and there's just pure double standards, and then the double standards become normalized as we are the exceptional nation, American exceptionalism. So basically, American exceptionalism means that we are the exceptions to all the rules, and we get to choose when the rules apply. So yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think the national sovereignty issue, the balloon gap issue, the military industrial, how the military industrial complex is actually seeing this as yet another opportunity. I mean, it's absurd. You know, one little fact check thing, which is kind of interesting, is that between, up to 60,000 feet above, that's considered a country's airspace under like international law. But there is this big space between that and 60,000 and to outer space, hundreds of thousands more feet, which is considered near space or the stratosphere. And so now the big discourse today is that, that this area of space has not been properly monitored by NORAD, and that this is sort of a big weakness. And the truth is that these areas aren't governed by any international rules. Many countries put weather balloons in the air constantly, research balloons. Many balloons go up per day. There's many balloon firms that in the United States that work in research agencies. I mean, it's very possible that the US is shooting down its own research. Like one arm of the US government is doing research, and then the other arm of the government is shooting it down. Because again, that's an abundance of caution. Just to be cautious, let's just shoot it down, because then no one will ever blame us for anything. Whereas if that balloon happened to be a Chinese balloon, we would be solved. So now there's going to be this new space race for the stratosphere, the near space race. And of course, China has balloons operating at that level. So does the US, so does Russia. I assume almost all the advanced industrial countries do. And I assume a lot of these civilian technologies do have military and espionage aspects to them. This is the whole history of spycraft. There's probably a Swedish spy balloon somewhere over, the US.
Definitely.
I'm not gonna. I mean, don't quote me on that.
But neutral.
But
okay.
Exactly.
Quote
but
unquote.
If NORAD finds the Swedish spy balloon, I don't think it's going to become an international crisis. That's why the deeper geopolitical question is ultimately the most important one.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. For any aliens out there, for these unidentified objects, just want to say on behalf of Breakthrough News, we are not supporters of just rampantly shooting things down without having any idea what they are. So we also want peace. So just remember, not all humans. It's an important question.
I agree. Keep me out of that.
Dr. Ben Becker, an academic of many different disciplines, including meteorology. Thank you for joining us on this segment here on Breakthrough News.
Thanks.
Of course. Look, right now, I'm just covering my
about
bases.
the alien. I just want to say something with the alien thing. I don't think it's right to automatically say we come in peace, because then you let down all your deterrents in case it's an aggressive alien.
I'm not letting down my deterrents. I'm saying we want peace.
We do, yes. Okay, we want peace. However,
obviously, if there's a dangerous alien invasion where they try to destroy us or enslave us as a species, you know, Well, I don't actually want to say this on
abundance-
air. I want all the aliens to know that, that humans are easy to work with and talk to
Let's be
and
honest.
negotiate
So
with.
given human history, like who was really going to enslave who? Honestly, I'm just
Listen,
saying.
anyone who can come to another planet has a lot of power, and I respect that power.
That's true.
all I'm
That's
going to
true.
say about that.
That is true. But out of an abundance of caution, I'm just kidding. Just
I
in
did
case
see
it's an
someone
alien,
on Twitter say, because they were like, oh, well, like if they were aliens, would it be so easy to shoot down their balloon? And someone said, well, those aliens and signs were defeated by water. And I was like, damn, that's a good point. Anyway,
wow. Yeah.
Anyway, long story short, that's going to do it for the show here today. Make sure you hit subscribe there on YouTube. Make sure you hit the bell so you can get the alerts for all the great stuff we have, like dispatches from Rania Khalek. By the way, the special rapporteur we had from the UN about Syria, there's a whole dispatches episode all about that, which I hope everyone goes and checks out. And what else should people do, Rania?
Well, they can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. And we encourage you to become a patron if you are able. That is what helps keep all of our excellent programming here, not just going, but growing. Oh, that's a cute tagline.
Did you just make that up?
Someone write that down. I did. Someone write that down.
Okay.
Not just going, but growing.
Thanks for repeating.
But on top of that, we are nearing the end of February. And like we said, trying to get 50 new patrons in the month of February. We're so close to our goal. And if we reach that goal, Eugene will start an Instagram account where he will post Instagram updates, everybody.
Wow.
Or we will do it for him.
Wow,
Regardless,
Jesus.
you will see. Yeah, you've got no choice. You're stuck. Regardless, even if you don't have Instagram or don't care about Instagram, still become a patron because it does help keep our shows going and growing.
That's true. Just
I'm
a
so
pawn
proud
in
of
your
it.
Instagram games.
Yes.
Bob
Yes,
Dylan,
indeed.
anybody? Okay. Anyway, long story short, obviously we need to end the show now since I'm paraphrasing Bob Dylan. Nonetheless, very, very happy to have everyone with us. Thanks to all our guests. Thanks to everyone behind the scenes, especially Matt and Emily, who are doing big, big work here in the booth to make this show possible. Definitely give them a round of applause. Thank you, Matt. But
Matt
we will
just
see
did that
you.
for himself. I love it.
We'll see you next week.
Yeah.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
We did it, Joe.